Aloha, everybody. I'm your host, Eva Andrade, and this is the Triple F podcast, Faith and Family First. And on today's show, we're going to ask the question: did Hawaii create an assisted suicide law that it has the strongest safeguards in the nation? Let's chat about that.
Well
Welcome to
done.
the show, Jim.
Well done.
Thank you. For all of you watching and listening, we welcome our viewers on YouTube, and we are welcoming our listeners on 94.9 KESU FM radio on Kauai and 1040 AM K-Light right here on Oahu. So welcome. I know you're all driving right now or at home listening. And Jim?
Find us on Spotify. Is there anything new?
I don't know. Well, every week something's new, but let's jump into the topic
Let's do
today
it.
because
Let's
we have
do
a
it.
special guest, Dr. Craig Nakatsuka, who I've known for several years as Hawaii was navigating the whole assisted suicide conundrum. I don't know what else better word to describe it, but Dr. Craig, welcome to the show today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So, Dr. Craig, let's do this first. For those listeners and viewers who may not know how assisted suicide came to Hawaii, let's talk about, first of all, what it is. So, what is assisted suicide?
So, physician-assisted suicide is the ability for someone who is evaluated and deemed, and I slow down when I say evaluated and deemed, as terminal, meaning having less than 6 months of life expectancy, to be able to have the option of having lethal medications prescribed for which that person has to self-administer that medication in order to pass away.
And your credentials are, I mean, you are a physician, and this is the type of work you do as a doctor, because we all know that if you have a sore leg, you're not going to go to an eye doctor. So you're one of the best doctors to talk about this subject with, because this is something you deal with in your practice. So let our listeners and viewers know a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so my background is I retired from Kaiser Medical Center after 34 years in practice, but the last 20 years of that career was involved in what's called the continuing care department, where I saw patients in nursing homes, care homes, and homes. And I really got to know patients and their environment a lot better because now I was in their territory, especially in homes, rather than they being in my territory in the doctor's office. And also, a large part of that, especially in the 10 years prior to my retirement from Kaiser, I was involved with a team of having conversations with patients and their families who had serious illnesses, and to help support them and give them information in navigating what the rest of the journey could look like, and really being able to more than anything, reassure them that regardless of all the concerns of finances and residences and options of medical care, including good symptomatic care, what kind of programs that they can be supported with, etc. Those were the things I was involved with. And then it became a fairly natural thing that I still think was God-led, because I'm not even sure how I ended up in Kaiser's continuing care department after doing office-based primary care medicine. But it became a natural fit when I was asked if I would be willing to be an associate medical director for one of the hospices here in town. So after doing palliative care consultation work as part of my work at Kaiser, which I just described, I then did hospice work for 4 years at a local hospice here, and really did much of the same things that I did, except these were now patients who were truly in their last chapter of their lives and giving direct support to them medically and holistically with the support.
So I like that you were telling everybody, Dr. Craig, about your background because it ties into why you do this, why you have a passion to fight on this issue. But what I want to do very briefly is let people know the history of how assisted suicide got legalized right here in the state of Hawaii. And for those listening and watching, they may remember that Governor Cayetano had instigated a blue ribbon panel on death and dying in 1998. And when the report came out, not only did the panel recommend physician assisted suicide, but the panel also recommended direct euthanasia. And I think a lot of people forget that that was the second recommendation that they made. The first bill on assisted suicide to legalize it here in the state was in 1999, and that was HB 1155. And for those of you who have been around a long time, like me and Dr. Craig, who have been at the Capitol weighing on this particular issue, you will remember that the bill made it to its first committee and then it was deferred because we kind of weren't ready for that. Well, you fast forward to 2018, and the legislature did pass a physician-assisted suicide bill. And what's interesting is when they passed it, there was steps that you have to take in order to access aid in dying. And I know that Jim has a specific question about that. But what I want to start with before Jim gets into his question is in the introduction to the bill, where the legislature likes to give their findings, they made it a point to say that Hawaii was going to have the strongest safeguards in the nation. And they were proud of that. And right away in 2019, they were already trying to loosen the safeguards. But I know that people listening and viewing might be thinking, well, okay, so assisted suicide's legal in the state of Hawaii. How do we access it? And I know, Jim, you had a specific question about that.
Well, actually, the question that I had was different. I still get, because it's in the news again, people telling me that they believe assisted suicide is simply taking a single pill. And we know that that's not true. So maybe as a physician, you can explain this 100 grams and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, so the medication that you get over the counter, whether it's something for indigestion, whether it's a headache pill, etc., let alone the types of medications that you get as a prescription, usually take at least 2 years of intensive scrutiny by the FDA. No matter what you think of the FDA, it is a very scrutinizing board. And in fact, over that 2-year period, many of the medications are rejected. Well, this is basically trying to come up with medications on the fly that will work. And certainly it's a cocktail of, right now, I think it's 5 different drugs taken in a sequence of 3, which even for the most sophisticated can be actually pretty daunting in being able to take all of these medications. And so there's no scrutiny over these medications. They are being made up on the fly to see if it works. Basically, it started off, well, we'll give 10 times the amount of the medications that are usually given for life and see if that does it. And from there, try and figure out side effects and does someone pass away right away without discomfort, et cetera. But the whole process itself is very disturbing.
But doctor, is it something the FDA should not approve as a study, which is, let's do a 2-year study with people trying to commit suicide to figure out what the right medicine is?
The data is already there with the annual data, which is still quite sparse. That's the minimum requirements that are requested for the state of Hawaii. But even from that data, you can see that it's far from being optimal. So that itself should be enough to raise red flags to the FDA.
Now, what's interesting is when the law was passed, what they were saying is you had to be 18 years old, right? So they had all these ways that you qualify, right? And then they also had said, okay, the process is you got to first approach your doctor. You got to get the second doctor to say yes. You've got to have some kind of counseling. But then as the bill was accepted, or I should say not accepted so much by Compassionate Choices, they could already see a couple of problems, right? the big problem was there were not physicians out there that were willing to do this. That was a big thing for them. Access, access, access.
And Compassionate Choices is the political social group in town supporting physician-assisted suicide.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is those of us in the faith-based community, we hear that all the time, an access issue, because that's the same reason they want to expand abortion, right? Because doctors don't want to do, it's funny, Dr. Craig, why do doctors not want to kill people? They don't want to kill old people. They don't want to kill young people. They don't want to kill babies. I mean, what's up with that? I think people have a problem with that, Doc.
Well, it's finally getting to the medical societies, and indeed what you said was just affirmed recently. I cannot go into all the details of that because some of the language is being formulated by two medical societies now, but it affirms that doctors are uncomfortable with that for good reason. If one is actually there for fulfilling the Hippocratic oath of doing no harm and doing whatever benefit to extend lives and extend quality of lives, it is not surprising that doctors are uncomfortable about prescribing something that is going to lead to what supposedly is instant death.
I think what, as listeners and viewers are wondering, why are we opposed to this, right? Because you have a lot of stories. I know you've heard them. I've heard them. Hey, but my auntie's grandmother's niece's nephew's uncle, he suffered, when he was dying. And, wouldn't it be a Christian thing to ease their suffering and to provide this? I mean, what are your thoughts when people say that to you?
It's beyond them as saying that to me. I actually, as a hospice doctor, would be getting these direct requests for medications and actually doing an evaluation for these people. I decided that it would be better if I actually participate in the evaluation rather than to opt out for conscience rights. And in the process, I actually get to actualize what my philosophy is. And the philosophy is, this is a sin and this is wrong. Yes, that is my Christian philosophy, but the philosophy is everyone is created in the image of God and should be able to be supported in that fashion towards a natural death if possible. And I go in there very confident of how they can actually be supported and explore. One of the best things we can do when we relate to other human beings is really listen to their stories carefully. And one great example I have is someone who, prior to the law, actually wanted to starve themselves to death and was really struggling to be able to, she got too hungry. And I had to support her. So I listened and listened and listened. And I realized that one of the issues was her husband's kind of reticence in showing his love to her. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the conversation, as I was facilitating this, he said, I really would miss you if you leave me. She then, about 5 minutes later in the conversation, reached out her right hand to his left hand. They're in a king-size bed, and said, thank you so much for saying that. You've never said that before. And I was proud enough to be able to facilitate that discussion, that the whole thought of killing herself never came up again. I met the husband about 2 months after she passed away naturally, and he was so grateful that I had that conversation with her. Mm-hmm. So that's basically being able to practice what I actually and be able to respond to these types of questions from patients and family members.
I think that's really good. And if your time is good, what I'd like to do is just, there's a couple more questions that I'd like to address with you, but I'd like you, if you're available, to stay. And for our listeners and viewers, if you want to see the full interview, then you'll need to go to YouTube to watch the entire interview. I know those listening on the radio, they're only going to get, half an hour, but maybe we're going to whet their appetite. So on YouTube, look for Hawaii Family Forum and check out the playlist, and then look for the assisted suicide discussion with Dr. Craig Nakatsuka, and then you can watch and listen to the full interview. But before we end this portion of the interview, Dr. Craig, what is your thoughts when you see the legislature trying to expand assisted suicide beyond what they said they were doing in 2018 when they said they were making these safeguards the strongest in the nation? So as a physician that practices until recently, I know you're retired now, but what are your thoughts when you see the legislature trying to do this?
Actually, I'm not retired. I'm actually helping another disadvantaged group that could be vulnerable to this. And I'm now the medical director for the Institute of Human Services. But basically, by rolling away the safeguards, you're just leaving it wide open for abuse, because these safeguards did allow for at least a more careful assessment for whether this person is making this request out of depression and despair and desperation. And also, are they capable of decision making? And all that starts to go away with the fact that these safeguards are being rolled away, and it's just truly ripe for abuse.
And don't you remember this when we were testifying with the original bill? We were telling everybody safeguards, 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 and they were laughing at us, thinking that we were living somewhere out in La La Land. But it is very true that all the very things we said are the things we're seeing taking place right now with the law. And for those of you that are listening, you have to go to YouTube and hear the rest of this, because Jim and I are going to get into the most recent report that was released from the Department of Health and get Dr. Craig's thoughts on that. But another thing I think that people will find very sad is this thing that the new bill that they're trying to pass right now is going to add advanced practice registered nurses and physician assistants to those who are going to be able to practice aid in dying, death with dignity, whatever they call. And as a physician who's trained, what are your thoughts on that?
So the reason why we have to be on our guard is because of what we're up against. Controls the narrative. This is all being piggybacked very subtly and, in my mind, evilly on access. I mean, they control the newspapers so that it made the front page about how medical care cannot be accessed by people in rural and underserved areas, and they cited medical aid in dying as one, and tried to play that up. Actually, if you look at the statistics, we should have more than enough providers, even given physician hesitancy, to be able to meet those needs of those individuals that perhaps are appropriately under the Act, qualify for this. And in fact, because there's hospices in every island, it's really based upon firing up anecdotal reports and influencing the legislature.
So in these last few minutes, and it's funny because I know that Jim has a lot of questions. So those that are listening, you have to go to YouTube and find out how this ends, because it's going to get exciting. But so, Dr. Craig, what is your thoughts on what's the answer? Because if we're telling people, as Christians, as people of faith, we don't think that doctor-assisted suicide is the answer. What is the answer? What can Christians do if they're afraid of what's going to happen at the end of their life?
Exactly. So I actually think that you individuals out there need to explain why this is a bad act, because it's just a slippery slope towards euthanasia, but more importantly, to give them knowledge of palliative and hospice care and say that you can be supported even with your fears and anxieties around dying, and you don't have to take that, so that you don't have to be desperate and saying you have to take advantage of this. One of the other myths is that, I don't want to die in pain, so I want to have this medication just in case that happens. Well, hospice physicians and staff are very well trained, and 99% of people, we can take care of their pain. And in fact, it's both legal and moral that if for everything we try, we cannot control their pain, it is allowable for us, even myself as a hospice doctor, to be able to actually have someone unconscious until they naturally pass away without, of course, having food and water. But so in 100% of cases, we can take care of pain symptoms, we can take care of nausea, etc.
And you can't do that for sadness, loneliness, depression without being able to counsel and hear and meet the whatever it is that they're telling you on those areas. But that seems to me to be what that legislation is actually pointed out. It's just sad, lonely, depressed older people.
Yeah, because some of you out there listening would say, well, but who wouldn't be sad, lonely, depressed, certainly during the COVID isolation period and having a diagnosis of, say, stage 4 cancer, et cetera, and therefore, why not? But I am saying that you out there in the audience have a part to play along with palliative and hospice care, compassionate physicians, social workers, et cetera, in being able to reassure the person that their needs can be met. And I am confident that their needs can be met.
And doctor, you convinced me of that years ago, that it is. And that's what my wife does for her business. She's a home care company owner, and that's what they do. So I agree with you. It's absolutely not only possible, happens every day, all the time.
And here's a tip for our viewers and listeners. When you are preparing your end of life directives, we strongly encourage that you put in there that you want access to good palliative care. You want to make sure that you're having these discussions with your doctor. Now, we threw that term around a couple of times, and I think in this last couple of minutes, Dr. Craig, tell people what palliative care is.
So palliative care is really holistic, supportive care for someone. By the way, and that includes people trained in navigating what can be a really thick tangle of how to see which doctor for what situation, which program for what. And so palliative care is there to go over information on how the journey will be in one's advanced illness and to support that holistically.
That's great. So for those of you listening on 94.9 KESU Radio FM on Kauai and 1040 AM K-Light right here in Oahu, make sure you go to YouTube, Hawaii Family Forum, and look for the interview with Dr. Craig Nakatsuka so you can hear the rest of this. And for those of you that are watching on YouTube, stick around because we've got a few more things to talk with Dr. Craig about. So mahalo for joining you.
Aloha.
All right, so Dr. Craig's, let's continue the interview because Jim and I, we had fun looking at the recent report that was released by the Department of Health. Now, interesting that in their testimony on this bill, and just for those of you that might want to be tracking, the bill that we're talking about is
2739.
No.
No.
HB 1823
Right.
is the current version that we're talking about. Jim referred to the original bill
Correct.
that actually got passed. See, I know we have viewers that are going like, what the heck? They can't keep track of all these bills. And you know what? I have fun because I work with a bunch of people like Dr. Craig, and I try to keep them updated on this issue. And so hopefully we don't inundate them too much with information. But so in the testimony from the Department of Health, right? And this is their recent testimony, March 21st. They say this, and I want to get both of your opinion on this, Jim as an attorney and you, Dr. Craig. So their testimony, obviously, right, is that they support this. And so I just find this so amusing. So the role of the Department of Health for Chapter 327L, Hawaii Revised Statutes, or the Our Care, Our Choice Act, is ministerial in function, which is to say that the Department of Health's primary responsibility is the collection and dissemination of forms, data, and reports in aggregate as required by law. Department of Health is compelled to collect data only on qualified patients who have followed through on every legally required step.
So why would they put that in their testimony? That's really odd.
It's very odd, but it's even more odd when you look at the report. So when you look at their report that it's listed as 2021, but they claim in their testimony that they're working actually on the 2021 numbers, and they claim that there were 70 patients. But when we look at their actual report, I find it very interesting that according to them, and this is their report, I will make this available.
Can I help explain that 2021 issue?
Oh, yeah.
So the law says that in July, they have to report for the prior year. And so the report we're looking at is not from 2021 because July 2022 hasn't hit. So it's 2020 reported in 2021.
Okay, so according to their report, which is it, you have to read these things and just kind of go, okay. So they have their bullet points under data collection. Now, mind you, on their testimony, which I just read to you, it says that that's their primary responsibility, right? Data collection. So the first bullet point they have on there is the number of qualified patients for whom a prescription was written was 37. Okay. Then they say the number of known qualified patients who died each year for whom a prescription was written is 32. Okay, it was 27 in 2019. So we're talking a difference of about 10 people between 27 and 37, which is fascinating. But here's my question. If access is a problem, and Dr. Craig, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So if access is a problem and we're only talking about between 32 and 70 people, I think you alluded to this earlier in the interview when you said that there should be more than enough providers. So would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, hospices, take care of hundreds of patients. I was working actually for one of the smaller hospices, and it still was 150 patients. So if one of the smaller hospices can take care of 150 patients, and the larger ones, up to 400, and you're only dealing with such a small number there, it's really these people that are trying to amplify anecdotally cases of people who cannot access any kind of support, etc. But how can that be when there's actually an ample supply there? And indeed, now some of the professional societies are looking at the data and saying, wait, we need to study this further for the same very question you're asking.
I find it so interesting because when we look at the numbers, again, going back to their testimony, and they said that that's their job to do this data collection. I'm very concerned that in this report, they're saying that there were 4 people, that there is absolutely no follow-up that was done. 4 people. And I quote, during the 2020 reporting year, the status of 4 patients is unknown. An unknown patient status occurs when a required follow-up form is not received by the department. I am very concerned that the Department of Health cannot make a follow-up phone call for 4 people. 4 people that there's no information.
So let's just expose the Department of Health. The Department of Health is the most prominent body in terms of COVID and case tracking, right?
Right.
So in that situation, when actually there's such an incredibly large emphasis on case tracking that led to the previous director, to me, appropriately being removed, how come in this situation they're saying we are only collectors of the data in this very narrowly confined conditions? Sending a message.
I'm right there with you, and I'm very concerned about this. And of course, because Jim actually does a lot of civil rights litigation right here in the state, I forwarded him the information that's in this new bill, and I'm very concerned that they're writing into the bill that the information collected pursuant to this chapter, and that's the Our Care, Our Choice Act by the department. This is the new language they're adding, or retained as the result of incidental or routine communication with providers and qualified patients shall not be disclosed, discoverable, or compelled to be produced in any civil, criminal, administrative, or other proceeding. I'm very concerned about that. Jim, I'd love to get your
There was
thoughts.
similar language in the prior bill, which bothered me a lot because there is this potential for abuse by somebody of a terminally ill person.
Did you just say that there's the potential of abuse?
And there are other family members who would not be able to determine if it happened because they can't get the info.
But the Department of Health, who is responsible
But that was
for
in the old
collecting,
bill.
well, no, but they're adding this other stuff now. They're or retained as the result of incidental or routine communication with providers and qualified patients.
Right. What I'm saying is it's equally as bad as it was originally or worse. But
I think nobody talked about that.
But it's the design of compassion and choices that nobody has any right to the information, so that nobody can make a claim, so that it's a free from liability act. And in fact, the old law said no liability if you do it in good faith, like you think you're
Okay,
following the rules.
so this is the information that I want to put out to the community. I mean, we have a law already on the books, just like with abortion. There's already a law in the book. But what I'm starting to do is tell people we may not be able to stop bad bills from taking place, but as a community, we have every right to make sure that those responsible for doing the reporting and doing whatever they're supposed to be doing are doing it according to the law. Now, I'm very concerned that in their testimony, they're claiming that they're responsible for all the data collection. But on the same term, it was their testimony this year, their first hearing, where they said, in their testimony, you can look this up, they said that they had attorneys calling them and asking for information. So they need to have this additional protection to save themselves from attorneys. I'm sorry, I'm on my soapbox, but I'm very upset about this because transparency was supposed to be a big thing with this law.
Well, Doc, I mean, what do you think we should do as this bill rolls through?
So because to some degree that's legalese and not in my territory of understanding quite everything about that, I actually have submitted testimony for the upcoming hearing on Friday that addresses the concern that from the physician side, we based a lot of our decisions on what's called evidence-based data. That is good data, hopefully to some degree research data, to make decisions. And the question is, how do we do that when this language, in fact, the way I put it, I said, if the Department of Health was doing this to prevent fishing trips by attorneys who just hear from some disgruntled family member, that may be one thing, but in the process to then put this language in that creates such a thick wall against quality improvement, I mean, they add the term administrative in there, then we can never get to the point of improving a system that's there. And that's basically from the medical standpoint what we want. We want to be able to balance benefit and access and no harm to the patient in the best manner we can. And for that, we need good data. And I'm concerned that this language prevents us from getting that.
Jim, I know you had a lot of notes on some of the numbers too.
Well, so this report that Eva was talking about says that 25 of the patients of the 32 that reported to have died, 25 of them self-administered the aid in dying medication. So they don't go on to tell us, okay, the other 7 didn't self-administer. How did they administer? And I mean, it's just baldly odd that they would leave that information out of their report. And then it also says that out of the 37 who qualified and received the medicine, only 32 were reported to have died, which means 5 still have the medication laying around, which is not a good thing either. How do you think the legislature should deal with this information?
Well, I must say that what the amendments are for this dropping down the safeguards, those numbers are going to have to get worse, because just from the medical standpoint, to give you examples, right now they have as one of the amendments that if the second and third amendments basically are, the second amendment has to do with the waiting period. So the waiting period, they want to drop from 20 days to 15 days. I'm not that opposed to that. But what I'm really opposed to is the fact that there's language there that says, if someone is not expected to survive the waiting period, that the process itself to get the medication is completely waived. And so you've got Parkinson's patients, you've got neurodegenerative patients, and in general, any patient. As a hospice doctor, one of the keys to deciding if someone likely has only 2 weeks of life left in them, is that they are severely debilitated, both physically, cognitively, and of course, not to speak of emotional stability wise. But if you are then waived from all of that, and you then, a doctor just writes the medication in the next 24 hours because someone says that that person only has 2 weeks to live, by definition, that prognosis is based upon a significant reduction in their ability to even self-administer the medication, to even the means of understanding it at that point, and let alone being in so much despair and making a request that I really want it now. It's almost an oxymoron at that point. And I think what it will do is actually make physicians who are pressured falsify the prognosis and say that someone who's got, say, 3 months to live only has 2 weeks to live so that they can get the medication. And bypass all of these procedures on the waiting period.
And actually, the original bill that's currently in effect before any amendment happens this legislative session, it required 2 physicians to evaluate the capability of the patient to qualify because of cognitive skill and other things, the terminal illness part, because that's not scientific. That's a huge guess. How long does somebody have to live? So what they're saying is, if you don't qualify anymore, then you don't have to qualify anymore.
I don't know of any physician assistant who actually has had the training to be able to assess for prognosis, which is in one of the amendments right now.
You know, I think something you said really struck me too, Dr. Craig. You know, you talked about that this is going to get worse, right? The numbers are going to increase. And I'm concerned already.
Well, I'm not saying that the numbers are going to increase. We actually have enough of supply. If it increases, it actually may be just a slight increase, but the numbers will probably get worse in terms of follow-up, you know, of the ones that did not pass away, or just gaps in the data because of the fact that there'll be these ways of now getting around the whole process of the waiting period.
So
Well,
can I ask another
yeah, hold
question?
on though. On the numbers though, I think why I'm concerned is in the recent testimony by the Department of Health, they say that in the most current year, it was 70 people. When this report that they actually have produced said in 2020 that it was 32, 37, depending on whether it's qualified or known qualified or whatever. But the point is they went from 37 to 70. So it's doubled in 1 year. Now that may not seem like a big number to people, but I'm concerned that the more they loosen the safeguards, the numbers are going to go up. And I think that it's something we should be very concerned about.
So what I wanted to ask you is about the 14 attending physicians that wrote prescriptions. They were on all the islands except for Kauai. And 4 patients disappeared. And what I'm wondering is, because if you're going to claim lack of access as the reason to lower the standard of who's allowed to write the prescription, did the 4 disappearing patients live on Kauai? So they actually do have a doctor there, but the report has missing patients and a missing island without a physician. So I don't know if you happen to know, whether that's true or not, but I'm, as a lawyer, I do not like when things don't match up.
Yeah, but again, we can ask the questions, but if going back to what that new amendment has in there, that if there's creating such a thick wall against accessing more data and making recommendations based upon the data that is there for answering just the very question you're asking, we're stuck.
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that, the Department of Health, again, in my mind, I know they have a lot of things to do, and I'm not trying to harass every worker at the Department of Health, nor to say that they don't do good work, because the Department of Health does a lot of things. What I'm concerned about, though, is a law like this that's so new. We want to make sure that if people are accessing it, I'm a Christian, a strong Christian, I don't believe people should access it. But for those that do, we want to make sure that they're doing it under every possible way that is legal under the law. And if there are any shenanigans going on, then people should have a right to be able to dig and find out what that is. And I think we're going down a very dangerous path.
Well, it's turning out it's not just Christians who are disturbed by this, or healthcare Christians, physicians like myself that are disturbed by this. It is starting to get the attention of the medical societies.
Good. And I think so in our last couple of
I
minutes.
have one more question.
Okay, go ahead.
So
Jim.
Doctor, I really appreciated the way you described your approach to the issue. And that's the reason that you are participating rather than boycotting on a religious exemption. If, in fact, this change occurs and the legislature allows APRNs and physician assistants to be the prescribers, do you have any plan to teach the Christian or the non-accepting nurses and physician assistants so that they too can use your philosophy to help the patients get what they really deserve and need?
So that is actually an approach I'm trying with the medical societies right now to say that, for instance, there is this drug called buprenorphine for addiction, for addicts, that actually takes away the cravings, but supposedly does not substitute as an addictive medication. You have to be certified and trained. A physician cannot just with his MD license prescribe that. They actually have to take a course on that, because the drug itself, prescribing the drug itself is not enough. You have to be able to present it to a patient, describing the context of the whole program involved along with the medication. So if they do that now as an imperative for this medication, it actually should be part of this act, of this bill, that training is mandatory before you can do it. Or you need to prove by taking a test that you are truly capable of doing that, not just because you have a social worker license, et cetera, et cetera.
But it's unlikely that our legislature is going to require that for physician-assisted suicide medication because of the politics. So if they're going to drop the licensing requirement for prescription, I would love to see your philosophy on this law shared and understood and exercised by the new level of prescribers. And you're the only person I've ever heard state it the way you did. I'm going to ask again, do you have any plan to teach willing APRNs and physician assistants on why they shouldn't be getting religious exemptions, but they should be working in this field so that the patients get what they actually need and deserve?
So two things. Number one, it's not just me that actually want to educate providers on that and want to make it mandatory, are willing and able to be able to educate. And I have influence and network with these palliative care and hospice physicians who would want to educate that, because I can't do it alone. And I am very confident that not only that some of these palliative care physicians can do it, they can do it in a far more compassionate and competent manner than even I can. And I hope will be one of them. But beyond that, one thing I want to say in closing is that human beings, whether you believe in an afterlife or not, usually can come to some reconciliation that they're going to die. I mean, death, like taxes, is just a known fact. And I have found that whether one is a believer in an afterlife or if one is a non-believer, that as far as death, in general, one is reconciled to that eventually. But what both Christians, including myself, and non-believers have very much in common is a fear not as much of death, but of dying, because that is indeed our fearful process. And because of the fear of the unknown, fear of dying with symptoms, fear of being a burden on family, fear of the indignity at the end of one looks like. And I have actually started a course on the hope we have in Christ to go through the dying process and being confident that we can handle it well. But I call it training, not trying. And that is to say that this is not for the 75-year-old, 80-year-old who has terminal disease to take this course. It really is the 50 or 60-year-old, because it is basically daily giving yourself up to the Lord and learning and training for this very last time here on earth, such that one can gain victory not over just death, but over the dying process.
Amen.
That is its promise in scripture, and I try to actualize it in my course.
That's great. So if any of our listeners or viewers want more information about that, send me an email at info@hawaiifamilyforum.org, and I will reach out to Dr. Craig, and I will make sure that you get connected if that's what you want to do. I want to just take a couple of minutes, well, not even a minute, just a couple seconds, to thank from the bottom of my heart all of the medical professionals out there, the nurses and the doctors, the ones that go to work every day to do what the Lord has called them to do, and that's to minister to people at various times in their life through health crises, through blessings like pregnancy and all of that. We've got a lot of faith-based health workers that every single day they start their day giving glory to God, and then they give glory to God with their hands and their hearts as they minister to people out there in the community. So if you are a medical professional and you're listening right now, big shout out to you for all that you're doing. And of course to you, Dr. Craig, for doing what you do in the community. We appreciate that. But it would be remiss of us too, Jim, if we didn't take a moment to just speak to those right now that may be having somebody in their life that is facing end of their life journey. And they're questioning and they're watching their loved one maybe suffer in their mind. Maybe they're sad and maybe they're angry at God. So Dr. Craig, why don't you speak to those people right now who may be listening or watching that are experiencing this very horrendous, hard moment in their life?
The best I can do is just cite scripture, and that's 2 Corinthians 4:16-17. So we do not lose heart, though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal.
Amen.
Amen.
And Jim, I will give you the last word.
Well, Dr. Craig, I really appreciate having known you as long as I have and watched all the things that you do on these really difficult, very difficult issues, especially when the news that people get is bad news. They don't hear your message. And so I really thank you for sharing with us today. And people that watch this, please share this video with anybody you know who has a family member or a friend or a coworker that's struggling with illness, and they are very depressed, sad, and lonely about it, because what Dr. Craig is sharing today is it's not the way it has to be. There's a lot of things that can be done. And taking deadly medication to end your life isn't really a choice. It's not necessary almost 100% of the time. So I just want to thank you very much, Doctor, for making this available.
Absolutely. And last shout out to Janet Hochberg for all the work she does out here in the community by visiting people's house and sharing her mana'o with them. So Janet, this is for you. Mahalo, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot. Aloha.
Thank you.